So today we're going to be talking about the topic of the Protestant Reformation. This is something that happened as a direct outgrowth of the Renaissance, which we've been talking about in class, of the scientific revolution, which you're going to be listening to in a video, and kind of the new ideas that were going on during this time period. So now if we look at the term Protestant, you might notice that the first couple words or letters of it make up the word protest. And then Reformation is reform. So this is going to be a protest against the Catholic Church that is going to lead to some pretty major reforms developing within the church. Now, one thing I just want to point out to you, which kids sometimes get confused. The leader of the Protestant Reformation is a man named Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was a German monk during the 1500s and led the Protestant Reformation. But what I don't want you to do is to make the mistake of confusing him with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the African-American civil rights leader during the 1960s. Sounds like, of course, Ms. Blanc, why are you going to make that mistake? But actually, it happens more than you would think. Just wanted to make that distinction before we start talking about anything. So the first question, though, is, what was religion like in Europe prior to the Reformation? And I wrote all this stuff down for you in the notes. So during the 1500s, you're only going to find Christians really in Europe. There's some other scattered Christians in parts of Asia, but it's pretty much Europe. And they're divided, as we know from talking about the Byzantine Empire, between the Roman Catholics in Western Europe and the Eastern Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe. They both were defending against Islam expanding. They tried to oust them out. They tried to go to the Holy Land and remove the Muslims. We know that didn't wind up going over very well. And ultimately, the Byzantine Empire is conquered by the Ottomans, and the Ottomans are a Muslim society, so the Byzantine Empire winds up becoming under the control of Muslims. So that's kind of what we're dealing with at this time. Now, as the church was going, as the 1500s were going on, the Catholic Church was really becoming rather corrupt. And there were a lot of different things that the Catholic Church was doing. If you look at this quote here, it says, "Thus the papacy," that being the Pope, "emerged as something between an Italian city-state and a European power, without forgetting at the same time the claim to be the vice-regent of Christ. The Pope often could not make up his mind whether he was the successor of Peter or of Caesar." So Peter being the first Pope and Caesar being the emperors of Rome. "Such vacillation," which means back and forth, "had much to do with the rise and the success of the Protestant Reformation." So like I said before, the Catholic Church was rather corrupt, and the Pope was sometimes seen as getting too involved in political issues and not really getting involved in religious issues, and people were beginning to get fed up with this. So some of the major abuses of the church I have written down here. One of them is called pluralism. Now, pluralism, think of plural, means many. So basically holding multiple church offices. So imagine if you're Catholic, your bishop is the bishop of your area and then is bishop in 5 other different places. And so that was something that was very common. And what that led to actually very commonly was what's known as absenteeism. So I'm going to skip down one for a second. Absenteeism, because they held so many different positions in so many different places, they never actually came to attend Mass or give the sacraments in the areas that they were in charge of. So it would be like having a priest if you were Catholic and the priest just never showing up to church and never giving Mass, basically not doing his job. The other major abuse is something called nepotism. And the way I always think about nepotism, if you look at the word, it says an NEP, think of it almost as nephew. So that basically means hiring family members and friends. So you're hiring someone because they're your friend, or you're hiring someone because they're a member of your family, not necessarily because they have seen the calling of God and they want to be a good priest. Another major thing that was going on is this is St. Peter's Basilica. I showed you a picture of this the other day. This was the Pope's church. This is not the church that was there at the beginning of this time period. Old St. Peter's was there. It was about 1,000 years old, and it was kind of crumbling and falling apart. So the Catholic Church decided that they wanted to rebuild Old St. Peter's and build this St. Peter's. And they needed to raise money. And that also angered some people in the methods in which they were raising money, and we'll get back to that one in a second. But here you can see this is the interior of St. Peter's. It's really very beautiful, but it was incredibly, incredibly expensive to build. And so one of the ways they figured out how to raise money for this was something called indulgences. So basically, when you go to the Catholic Church, if you're Catholic and you go and you give confession, you're supposed to be given a penance, something you could do to make up for your sins. And what the church started doing is charging for the penance. So if you give us X amount of money, your sins will be forgiven. Then it really started getting out of hand, and it started becoming, think about all of your dead relatives who didn't quite make it into heaven. Pay some money to the church and you can get them into heaven. There was actually a monk, his name was Johann Tetzel, and he came up with a little jingle that says, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Now, purgatory was that limbo area between heaven and hell. So when you died, if you didn't get to give your last rites, or it wasn't quite clear if you were so bad that you needed to go to hell, but you weren't so good that you get to go to heaven, you get stuck in purgatory. So basically the church was saying you could pay money and you could get out, you could get your dead relatives out of purgatory. That's something that also upset the people. In addition, the priests were not being properly educated. Now, priests are supposed to give services in Latin. Many of them didn't even really know Latin, so they were just kind of like mumbling and making up stuff in front of the church. So they were not properly educated, and they were becoming increasingly just caught up in worldly affairs and not really being focused on the church. The popes were living these really lavish lifestyles. They were patrons of the arts, but they were, paying for these with things like indulgences, or they were paying for them by raising the fees for services such as marriages and baptisms and all these things that the church is supposed to do for the people. So people were beginning to get fed up. One of those people was Martin Luther. So that takes us to this question: what was Martin Luther's protests against the church? Now, Martin Luther actually was a priest. He was a German priest. He was a Catholic monk. He originally studied law. A near-death experience when he was young, when he was in law school, led him to go to the church. He basically said to God, as he thought he was going to die, if I make it out of this, God, I promise I'll go into the church. And he did. So he gave up law and went into the church. So he did not like what he saw going on in the church. He felt that indulgences in particular had no place in the Bible. There was no justification for indulgences in the Bible. And he felt that the Pope did not have authority to release people from purgatory. He also really thought that there wasn't really anything that's purgatory. There's nothing in the Bible that supports the idea of purgatory. So what he decided to do, and he actually was a professor of theology in Wittenberg in Germany. So what he decided to do is he was going to put a list of his grievances, a list of his things against the church called theses, on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Now, Wittenberg was, like I said, it was a college town. So it was common for people to, if they wanted to start a debate, it was common for people to post something on the door of the cathedral, and this would start like an intellectual scholarly debate. That was his motivation when he did this. He wanted to fix some of the problems that he saw in the church. So he goes to the church, he puts these 95 theses on the door. The issue is that this is the age of the printing press. So the printing press, these ideas are copied and these ideas are distributed, and these ideas begin to pick up momentum outside of the little town of Wittenberg, where Luther kind of had intended for it to kind of remain. So here you can see this is the Cathedral of Wittenberg. These are the doors today. These are some of the theses. Now, a couple of things, and I don't know why my dog is going crazy. A couple of other key vocabulary words that we've already kind of gone over. Indulgences, which is a pardon releasing you from your sins. The 95 Theses, these are the list of arguments that Luther had against indulgences and other things. A heretic is someone who speaks out against the official teachings of the Catholic Church, and you can imagine Luther is going to be branded a heretic for these ideas. He is eventually going to be excommunicated, which means to be banished from the Catholic Church, and the church is going to want him to recant or to give up his beliefs. So the question is, what was the impact of these 95 theses? So the first thing, like I said, is it was printed and it was distributed throughout Germany and throughout across Europe. And that's why the Catholic Church, and I don't know why my dog is going crazy, I'm sorry. That's why the Catholic Church began to demand that Luther recant or take back his ideas. So as a result, because Luther refused to, in 1521, he excommunicates Luther. In fact, Luther actually takes the papal bill of excommunication, so there's official letter saying he's being excommunicated, and he burns it. Kind of makes his statement very clear. So here we can see this map shows us the number of countries, the number of cities that have printing presses, and when printing first began. So we see that printing presses were pretty widespread throughout Europe during this time period. Now, another thing that's also important to note is that Luther lived in Germany, which was the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was not very strong or powerful. It was made up of about 360 different political entities that all came under the control of a Holy Roman Emperor who was elected. When you were elected Holy Roman Emperor, you were elected for life, and then when you died, a new Holy Roman Emperor was elected. Typically, it always was from one particular family, who happened to also be the ruling family of Spain. The German princes did not like Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, and they would do anything to weaken his power. Meanwhile, Charles V, was very much against Martin Luther, so a lot of the German princes supported Luther as a way to get back at Charles V. So there's a lot of political maneuverings going on with this. So here you can see here's Charles V. And Frederick the Wise, who's the Prince of Saxony, is one of the princes who kind of protects Luther, even after Charles V says that no one should be allowed to aid Luther within Germany. So on June 15th, 1520, Pope Leo X in the papal bill warned Luther that he will be excommunicated unless he recants 41 sentences included in his 95 theses within the next 60 days, which I told you Luther then took and burned. And so here we can see this is what the Pope's response to this was. He says, "Arise, O Lord, and judge your own cause. Remember your reproaches to those who are filled with foolishness all through the day. Listen to our prayers, for foxes have arisen, seeking to destroy the vineyard whose winepress you alone have trod. When you were about to ascend to your Father, you committed the care, rule, and administration of that vineyard, an image of the triumphant church, to Peter as the head, and your vicar and his successors. The wild boar from the forest seeks to destroy it, and every wild beast feeds upon it." So he's talking about Luther as the wild boar who is seeking to destroy the foundation of the church. Luther is brought before what was known as the Diet of Worms, which was the assembly of German princes in 1521. Pope Leo X and Charles V wanted Luther to recant his statements, and he refused. He's declared an outlaw. His literature is banned, and it's required that he is arrested. Now, there also was a series of peasant revolts occurring in Germany in the mid-1520s that actually tended to radicalize Luther's ideas. Peasants wanted serfdom abolished. They wanted lesser tithes, which is the money to pay to the church, lesser church restrictions. Most of these rebellions were put down, and many churches were burned down, but many of these peasants became followers of Luther as a way to combat the church. Luther ultimately renounces the church, leaves the church, and decides to get married. And many princes help Luther, including Frederick, and one of the reasons why they do that is, like I said before, because they wanted to get back at Charles V. So the next question becomes, what exactly were Luther's teachings? And I have these written down for you. So Luther's main ideas was salvation through faith alone, meaning as long as you accept Christ, you're going to be saved. But Luther also felt that the Bible and not the church was the sole source of religious truth. So he rejected the whole idea of the priest and the church hierarchy and the papacy. He rejected all of that. He said masses should be said in the common language, not in Latin, because in the Catholic Church they were always performed in Latin. He said they should be in the language of the people. And he starts printing the Bible in different languages. He does a German translation of the Bible. And this was also considered an act of heresy because the Bible, according to the Catholic Church, was only supposed to be in Latin. From there, Protestantism begins to spread. And it spreads mostly into Northern Europe. Southern Europe, areas like Spain and Italy, tend to very much stay Catholic. But anything on this map that tends to have that's not red is not Catholic. So we see Protestantism, the ideas of Protestants begin to spread. Everything on this map that's white, that's Orthodox. So here you can see everything that's kind of in these greenish colors are Protestant. So Luther's got 95 theses, but a papal indulgence ain't one. So do you think in your opinion, could the Protestant Reformation have been prevented? I want you to think about that.